It was supposed to be the night of the year. A billionaire's mansion glowing with golden lights, champagne flowing like rivers, cameras flashing as the city's elite celebrated in luxury. But in one moment, everything shattered. A sound echoed through the marble halls that would bring an empire to its knees. A slap, one slap, and the woman who received it would do something that no one, not the billionaire, not his lawyers, not even the world watching, could have predicted. What happened next didn't just shock a nation. It exposed the kind of truth that powerful people spend millions to bury. This is the story of Grace Harmon, a 32-year-old maid who worked in the shadows of one of America's wealthiest men, and Richard Cole, a 68-year-old billionaire whose face was plastered on magazine covers, whose name was whispered in boardrooms, whose charitable foundation fed thousands. On the surface, he was untouchable, beloved, respected, but behind closed doors, a different man existed, and Grace saw him. She saw everything. For 6 months, she cleaned his floors, served his guests, and kept her head down, until the night of October 14th, 2024, when the mask slipped and the world saw what she had been living with all along. But here's the question nobody could answer in those first chaotic hours after the video went viral. Who was Grace Harmon really? And why did one slap ignite a firestorm that would unravel a billion-dollar empire, expose decades of corruption, and force an entire nation to ask, how much are we willing to ignore when wealth and power are involved? Grace Harmon grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. Her father died when she was 12, leaving her mother, Susan, to raise 3 kids on a waitress salary. Grace was the oldest. She learned early that life wasn't fair, that hard work didn't always pay off, and that sometimes you had to swallow your pride just to survive. By the time she was 18, she was working 2 jobs to put herself through community college. She studied accounting, dreamed of working in an office, maybe even starting her own business one day. But life had other plans. Her mother got sick. Cancer. Stage 3. The medical bills piled up faster than Grace could count. She dropped out of school, picked up a 3rd job, and did everything she could to keep her family afloat. But it wasn't enough. The hospital bills crushed them. They lost the house. Her younger brother dropped out of high school to work, and Grace, exhausted and desperate, took a job she never imagined she'd take. She became a maid, not just any maid. She joined the staff of Richard Cole, one of the richest men in the country. At first, it seemed like a blessing. The pay was decent, better than anything she'd had before. The mansion was massive, almost like a museum, filled with art and marble and rooms bigger than her childhood home. Richard Cole himself was rarely around. When he was polite, charming even, the kind of man who smiled for the cameras and shook hands with presidents. But Grace wasn't naive. She'd worked long enough in service jobs to know that rich people had 2 faces, the one they showed the world and the one they showed the people who cleaned up after them. For the first few months, she kept to herself. She worked her shifts, sent money home to her mother, and avoided attracting attention. The other staff members were kind but guarded. They'd all seen things, heard things. There was an unspoken rule in that house. You didn't ask questions. You didn't repeat what you saw. You smiled, nodded, and stayed invisible. Grace was good at being invisible. She'd been doing it her whole life. But she was also observant. She noticed the late-night meetings in Richard's office, the guests who arrived without being announced, the way certain conversations stopped the moment she entered a room. She noticed the documents left carelessly on desks, the phone calls taken behind closed doors, the envelopes of cash handed to men in expensive suits. She didn't say anything. What could she say? Who would believe her? But she remembered. She always remembered. Richard Cole was 68 years old and had built his fortune in real estate and private equity. On paper, he was a self-made man, the American dream personified. He'd grown up middle class, worked his way through business school, and made his first $1 million by 30. By 50, he was a billionaire. His company owned hotels, office buildings, luxury apartments in every major city. He sat on the boards of hospitals and universities. He donated millions to charity. His foundation provided scholarships to underprivileged kids, funded cancer research, built schools in underserved communities. The media loved him. Politicians courted him. Celebrities attended his parties. But the people who worked for him told a different story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The staff at Richard Cole's estate knew him as a man with a temper. He didn't yell often, but when he did, it was vicious. He expected perfection. A glass left on a table, a towel folded the wrong way, a meal served 30 seconds late, any of it could set him off. Most of the time, he'd just glare, make a cutting remark, dock someone's pay. But there were stories, whispered in the kitchen late at night when the supervisors weren't around. A housekeeper fired on the spot for accidentally breaking a vase. A chef screamed at until he quit. A driver who made a wrong turn and was humiliated in front of guests. Grace had heard the stories, but she'd never experienced it herself. She was careful. She followed every rule, anticipated his needs, stayed out of his way. For 6 months, it worked, until the night of his birthday party, October 14th, 2024. The event had been planned for months. It was Richard's 68th birthday, and he wanted it to be spectacular. The guest list included senators, CEOs, actors, musicians, people whose names you'd recognize instantly. The mansion was transformed into something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers, live orchestra, champagne towers, ice sculptures, servers in black tie uniforms gliding through crowds with trays of caviar and lobster. Grace was assigned to work the main ballroom. Her job was simple. Circulate with a tray of champagne, keep glasses full, stay pleasant, stay invisible. She'd done it 100 times before at smaller events. This was just bigger, louder, more cameras. Everything was going smoothly until around 10 p.m. Grace was refilling glasses near the main staircase when she noticed a commotion near the terrace doors. A woman in a designer gown, dripping in diamonds, was laughing loudly, already drunk. She stumbled slightly, nearly knocking into Grace. Grace steadied her, smiled politely, and stepped back. But as she turned, her tray tilted, just slightly, just enough. A single champagne flute tipped, and the golden liquid splashed onto the woman's dress. Not much. Maybe a few drops. But enough. The woman gasped, more dramatic than necessary, and suddenly everyone nearby turned to look. Grace froze. Her heart hammered in her chest. She immediately apologized, grabbed a napkin, tried to help. But the woman waved her off, laughing it off, saying it was fine, accidents happen. Grace thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Richard Cole had been watching from across the room, and he wasn't laughing. He crossed the ballroom in seconds, his face tight with anger. Grace didn't even see him coming. He grabbed her arm, hard enough to hurt, and yanked her away from the guests. She stumbled, nearly dropped the tray. And then, in front of 200 people, in front of cameras and phones and flashing lights, Richard Cole raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed. The room went silent. Grace's cheek burned. Her ears rang. She tasted blood where her lip had split against her teeth. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, staring at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. And for a moment, just a moment, Richard Cole looked almost afraid. Then he turned, straightened his jacket, and walked away as if nothing had happened. But the phones were already out. The videos were already uploading. And within minutes, the world knew what he'd done. By midnight, the video had been viewed 10 million times. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Every news outlet, every social media platform, every talk show. The billionaire who slapped his maid. The headline wrote itself. People were outraged. Celebrities condemned him. Activists called for boycotts. His company's stock dropped 12% in a single day. Richard Cole issued a statement within hours, a carefully worded apology written by his PR team. He claimed he'd been drinking, that he was under stress, that he deeply regretted his actions and was seeking help. He offered Grace a settlement, a generous one, enough money to change her life. All she had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. Most people would have taken it. Most people would have walked away, taken the money, and tried to move on. But Grace didn't. The morning after the party, she didn't show up for work. The other staff members assumed she'd been fired or paid off, but she hadn't been fired, and she hadn't taken the money. She'd gone home to her small apartment, locked the door, and made a decision. For 6 months, she'd been invisible. For 6 months, she'd watched and listened and stayed silent, but not anymore. Grace Harmon had kept copies of documents she'd seen left out in Richard's office, copies of emails she'd glimpsed on his laptop screen, copies of financial records that didn't add up, invoices that didn't match, donations that never reached their intended recipients. She didn't know what it all meant at first. She wasn't a lawyer or an accountant anymore, but she knew enough to recognize that something was wrong. And now, with the world watching, she had a choice. Stay silent, take the money, and let him win. Or speak up, risk everything, and see if the truth mattered more than power. She chose the truth. 3 days after the slap, Grace contacted a journalist. Not just any journalist. A woman named Sarah Brennan, an investigative reporter known for taking down corrupt politicians and corporate criminals. Sarah had been following the story like everyone else, but she didn't expect what Grace brought her. Boxes of documents, printed emails, bank statements, photographs, evidence of years of financial fraud, money laundering, and charity embezzlement. Richard Cole's foundation, the one that fed thousands and built schools and funded cancer research, was a front. Millions of dollars donated by well-meaning contributors had been funneled into offshore accounts, shell companies, and Richard's personal investments. The scholarships he bragged about, most of them didn't exist. The schools he claimed to build, half-finished or never started. The cancer research, a handful of small grants used as tax write-offs while the bulk of the money disappeared. Grace had seen it all. She'd pieced it together slowly, over months, never quite sure what she was looking at. But now, with Sarah's help, the picture became clear. Richard Cole wasn't a philanthropist. He was a con man. And Grace had the proof. Sarah spent 2 weeks verifying everything. She brought in forensic accountants, legal experts, former employees who corroborated Grace's claims. And then, on November 1st, 2024, Sarah published the story. The headline read, "The Billionaire's Lie: How Richard Cole Stole Millions in the Name of Charity." The reaction was immediate and explosive. The FBI launched an investigation. The IRS froze his accounts. His board of directors resigned. His celebrity friends distanced themselves. Protests erupted outside his mansion, and Grace Harmon, the maid who'd been slapped on camera, became the woman who brought down a billionaire. The media couldn't get enough of the story. Within days, Grace went from being a victim to being a hero, a whistleblower, the face of a movement. People started calling her brave, fearless, a voice for the voiceless. But Grace didn't feel like a hero. She felt exhausted, scared, overwhelmed. She'd never wanted attention. She'd only wanted justice. Now her face was on every screen, her name in every headline. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Strangers recognized her on the street. Some praised her. Others accused her of being a liar, a gold digger, someone who'd manipulated the situation for fame. The online attacks were brutal. People dug into her past, criticized her choices, questioned her motives. Richard Cole's lawyers painted her as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. They claimed she'd stolen the documents, that she'd fabricated evidence, that she was being used by the media to destroy an innocent man. But the evidence didn't lie. The FBI's investigation confirmed everything Sarah had reported: bank records, emails, testimonies from other employees. All of it pointed to a massive, coordinated fraud. Richard Cole had spent decades building an image of generosity while quietly stealing from the people who trusted him most. donors who thought they were helping sick children, families who believed their contributions were funding scholarships, communities that thought they were getting new schools. All of them had been deceived, and Grace had exposed it all. But the story wasn't over. In mid-November, just as the case seemed open and shut, a new twist emerged. One of Richard's former business partners, a man named Michael Torres, came forward with a shocking claim. He said that while Richard was guilty of financial crimes, he hadn't acted alone. Michael claimed that Richard's entire board of directors had known about the fraud for years and had actively participated in covering it up. More than that, Michael alleged that one board member in particular, a man named Gerald Finch, had orchestrated parts of the scheme and had recently tried to frame Richard for crimes Gerald himself had committed. It was a bombshell. Suddenly the narrative shifted. Was Richard Cole a mastermind, or was he a scapegoat? Had he been running the operation, or had he been manipulated by people even more ruthless than himself? The prosecutors scrambled to verify Michael's claims. They subpoenaed more records, interviewed more witnesses, dug deeper into the Foundation's financial history. And what they found was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The fraud had been going on for over 20 years. It had involved not just Richard and his board, but politicians, accountants, bankers, lawyers, a network of people who'd all profited from the lies. And at the center of it all was Gerald Finch, a man who'd stayed in the shadows while Richard took all the credit and eventually all the blame. Grace watched all of this unfold from a distance, still processing everything that had happened. She'd expected to feel vindicated, satisfied, relieved. But mostly, she just felt sad. Sad for all the people who'd been hurt. Sad for the donors who'd been lied to. Sad, in a strange way, even for Richard Cole, a man who'd had everything and thrown it all away for greed. The trial began in early January 2025. It was one of the biggest white-collar crime cases in years. Richard Cole, Gerald Finch, and 4 other board members were charged with fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. The courtroom was packed every day. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters lined up for seats, and protesters gathered outside holding signs that read, "Justice for the victims" and "Jail the billionaire." Grace was called to testify in late January. She'd been dreading it for weeks. She wasn't afraid of telling the truth, but she was afraid of facing Richard again, afraid of the questions, the scrutiny, the judgment. When she walked into the courtroom, the room went silent. All eyes were on her. Richard sat at the defense table, looking older, thinner, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. He didn't look at her. Grace took the stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. And then she did. She told them everything, about the documents she'd found, the conversations she'd overheard, the inconsistencies she'd noticed. She explained how she'd made copies, how she'd contacted Sarah, how she'd never intended to become a public figure but couldn't stay silent, knowing what she knew. The defense attorney tried to rattle her. He asked why she'd waited so long to come forward. He questioned her motives, suggested she'd been paid by the media, implied she'd stolen documents illegally. But Grace didn't waver. She answered every question calmly, clearly, honestly. And then the prosecutor asked her the question everyone had been waiting for. Why did you do it? Why risk everything to expose him? Grace paused, looked down at her hands, then looked up at the jury. Because it wasn't just about me, she said quietly. It was about every person who donated their hard-earned money thinking they were helping someone. It was about every family who believed their child would get a scholarship. It was about the truth. And if I stayed silent, I'd be just as guilty as the people who lied. The courtroom was silent. Even Richard's lawyer didn't have a response to that. But then something unexpected happened. During a recess, one of the prosecutors approached Grace with new information. They'd uncovered evidence that Gerald Finch had been planning to testify against Richard, claiming that Richard had forced him and others to participate in the fraud under threat of financial ruin. It was a classic move. Shift the blame, save yourself. But there was a problem. Some of the evidence supported Gerald's claim. Emails showed Richard pressuring board members, making veiled threats, demanding loyalty. It complicated everything. Was Richard the villain, or was he also a victim of a system he'd helped create? Grace was torn. She hated what Richard had done. She hated how he'd treated her, how he'd treated his staff, how he'd stolen from people who trusted him. But she also believed in the truth. All of it. Not just the parts that fit the narrative. So when the prosecution asked if she'd be willing to testify about the full scope of what she'd seen, including evidence that might complicate Richard's guilt, she said yes. It wasn't a popular decision. Activists accused her of protecting a billionaire. Online commentators said she'd been bought off. Even Sarah, the journalist who'd helped her, questioned whether she was making the right call. But Grace didn't care about popularity. She cared about honesty. On February 10th, 2025, Grace took the stand again. This time, she presented evidence that showed the full picture. Yes, Richard had participated in fraud. Yes, he'd benefited from it. But Gerald Finch and others had been the architects, and Richard had been as much a pawn as a player. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was split. Richard Cole was found guilty of fraud and embezzlement, but acquitted of conspiracy. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay back $20 million. Gerald Finch and 2 other board members received longer sentences. The others took plea deals. But the story didn't end there. In March 2025, something extraordinary happened. Grace Harmon received a letter. It was from Richard Cole, written from prison. She almost didn't open it. Part of her didn't want to hear anything he had to say. But curiosity won. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages long. In it, Richard didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He simply told the truth. He admitted that he'd known what was happening, that he'd chosen to look the other way because it was easier, because he liked the power, the respect, the image of being a good man. He admitted that he'd been a coward, and he thanked Grace, not for exposing him, but for refusing to lie. He wrote, "You could have twisted the truth to make me look worse or better. You could have taken the money and disappeared, but you didn't. You told the truth, even when it didn't benefit you. I spent my whole life lying, and it cost me everything. You spent one moment being honest, and it gave you something I never had: integrity." Grace read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. 2 months later, Grace used the money from a book deal and speaking engagements to start a foundation, not a fake one, a real one. It provided legal aid and financial support to service workers who'd been abused, exploited, or silenced by their employers. She called it the Invisible Voices Project. The name was deliberate. For too long, people like her had been invisible. Now, she was making sure they were heard. By the summer of 2025, the foundation had helped over 300 people. Maids, drivers, cooks, nannies, people who'd been mistreated and had no one to turn to. Grace didn't do interviews. She didn't seek attention. She just worked. Quietly, steadily, the same way she always had. But this time she wasn't invisible. She was seen. And her voice, the one she'd kept silent for so long, was finally being heard. As for Richard Cole, he served his sentence quietly. No interviews, no memoirs, no attempts to rehabilitate his image. When he was released in 2033, he moved to a small town in Montana and lived a quiet life. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but every year, on the anniversary of the slap, he donated anonymously to Grace's foundation. She never acknowledged it, but she knew, and in a strange way, it was enough. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement, that actions had consequences, that the truth mattered, and that sometimes the people you think are powerless are the ones who change everything. So let me ask you something. If you were in Grace's position, what would you have done? Would you have taken the money and walked away? Would you have exposed the truth knowing it could destroy your life? And here's the harder question. If you were Richard Cole, at what point would you have stopped? When would you have said no? Or would you have kept going, telling yourself it was just business, just the way things worked, just what everyone else was doing? Think about the people in your own life, the ones who clean your offices, serve your food, watch your children. How often do you really see them? How often do you acknowledge that they're human beings with dreams and struggles and voices that deserve to be heard? Grace wasn't special because she was brave. She was special because she refused to disappear. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That power isn't just about money or status or influence. Power is about visibility, about being seen, about refusing to let anyone make you invisible. This story isn't just about a billionaire and a maid. It's about all of us, about the choices we make when no one's watching, about whether we choose comfort or truth, silence or courage. And maybe, just maybe, it's about recognizing that the people we overlook every day might be the ones who change the world. So what do you think? Was justice served? Did Grace do the right thing by telling the whole truth, even when it complicated the story? And what about Richard? Does time in prison and a lifetime of regret make up for the harm he caused? I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done what Grace did? And if you were one of the people who donated to Richard's fake charity, how would you feel knowing your money had been stolen? Would you forgive him, or would you want more? If this story made you think, if it moved you, if it made you see something differently, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that dig deep into the truth and don't look away, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories out there, more people like Grace, and more truths that need to be told. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do in this world is refuse to be silenced.